It's 1995. You're sitting in a movie theater. The lights go down. And for the next 3 hours, you watch two of the greatest actors who ever lived, Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, share the screen for the very first time. Not just in the same movie, in the same scene, across a table, talking, just talking. And somehow, it's the most intense thing you've ever seen in your life. You walk out of that theater thinking you just watched fiction. You think someone made this up. You think a Hollywood writer sat in a room somewhere in Los Angeles, drank a lot of coffee, stared at a blank page, and invented Neil Macaulay, invented Vincent Hanna, invented that coffee shop conversation, invented that final shootout, invented all of it. But here's the thing. They didn't. Not one bit of it. And today, I'm going to prove that to you word by word, fact by fact, scene by scene, from the very beginning of a man's life in 1914 all the way to a parking lot in Chicago in 1964, where everything ended the way it was always going to end. Everyone who loves Heat thinks they know this story. They think they know Neil Macaulay. They think they know the heist. They think they know the coffee shop scene. They think they know the ending. They've watched this movie 5 times, 10 times, maybe more. They quote the lines. They know the shots. They know exactly what De Niro looks like standing on that beach at night, looking out at the water, thinking about a woman he just met and a life he'll never have. They think they know everything. But nobody, and I mean nobody, tells you the complete truth about where this story actually came from. Nobody sits down and takes you all the way back. Nobody shows you the real man, the actual human being. The person who was born in a small town in Iowa in 1914 and who made choices, specific, deliberate, calculated choices, that would eventually inspire one of the greatest crime films ever made. Nobody tells you that the coffee shop scene actually happened. In real life, with real words, words we actually know, words that were recorded, words that two men actually said to each other, face to face, across a table, knowing full well that the next time they met, one of them might not walk away. Nobody tells you about Alcatraz, about the isolation, about the intelligence score that placed this man in the top percentile of every federal prisoner in America. Nobody tells you that he ran illegal operations from inside Alcatraz for years without getting caught. Nobody tells you that he came out of prison at 48 years old with nothing, no money, no safety net, no family waiting, and immediately, methodically, with the discipline of a military general, put together a crew and went back to work. Nobody tells you that the final score in the movie, the massive downtown Los Angeles bank robbery for $12 million, was actually a grocery store robbery in Chicago for $13,000. And that it ended exactly the same way. And nobody, not one person, tells you the full circle moment. The thing that happened in 1997 that proves this story never really ended. That it just kept going. That it rippled outward in ways that nobody could have predicted and that real people paid for with their lives. That's what we're doing today. All of it. Every single piece. From the very beginning to the very end. Sit down. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and I promise you, every single second of it is worth it. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Drop in the comments right now. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? I'm serious. I read every single comment. I love knowing who's in this with me. Whether you're watching this at 2 in the afternoon on a Sunday, or it's 3 in the morning and you can't sleep and you stumbled onto this video somehow, drop your location and your time. Tell me you're here. And if you're new to this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not later. Right now. Because we do this every single week. Deep dives like this one, into the real stories behind the things you thought you already knew. Real history. Real people. Real facts that Hollywood either changed, cut, or buried entirely. And if this kind of thing is what you've been looking for, then you are exactly in the right place. Smash that like button too. Seriously, it takes 1 second and it means everything for getting this story in front of more people who need to see it. Now, let's go back to Chicago. Actually, let's go back even further than that. Let's go back to Iowa, to a small town called Polk, to the year 1914, to a baby boy who had no idea what his life was going to become. Neil Macaulay was born on February 2nd, 1914, in Polk County, Iowa. Let that date sit for a second. 1914. The year World War I began. The year the world tipped into a kind of chaos that nobody had ever seen before. The year that everything changed for an entire generation. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in a small, quiet corner of Iowa that most people couldn't find on a map if you paid them, a boy came into the world. He wasn't born into anything remarkable. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't born into a famous family or a powerful one, or even a particularly notable one. He was born into an ordinary American life in an ordinary American place in a time when ordinary American life was hard and getting harder. The Great Depression was still 15 years away, but the economic pressures that would create it were already building. The kind of poverty and desperation that shaped an entire generation of American criminals, the kind that gave rise to Dillinger, to Pretty Boy Floyd, to Bonnie and Clyde, that pressure was already there, already accumulating, already pressing down on families like the McCauley family in ways that were quiet and invisible and absolutely real. We don't know everything about Neil McCauley's childhood. The historical record on his early years is incomplete, the way historical records on people who weren't famous yet always are. But what we do know tells us something important. What we do know is that whatever path this boy was going to walk, he chose it early. He didn't stumble into crime the way some people do, gradually, accidentally, through a series of small bad decisions that compound over time until suddenly you're somewhere you never meant to be. Neil McCauley's relationship with the criminal world was more deliberate than that. More intentional. More like a career choice than a mistake. And here's the number that tells you everything about who this man was. By the time Neil McCauley was released from prison in 1962, he had already spent 25 years behind bars. 25 years. Think about that. Really think about it. He was 48 years old when he walked out of prison in 1962, which means that of his 48 years on Earth, 25 of them, more than half of his entire life, had been spent incarcerated. He had given more time to prison than most people give to their entire careers. More time than most people spend raising their children from birth to adulthood. He had spent more of his life inside a cell than outside of one. And here is the detail that turns this from a sad statistic into something almost incomprehensible. 8 of those 25 years were spent at Alcatraz. 4 of those 8 years were spent in complete isolation. Now, if you already know what Alcatraz was, skip ahead a few seconds in your mind. But if you don't, or if you've only heard the name and never really understood what it meant, let me tell you. Because this detail changes everything about how you understand Neil McCauley. Everything about how you understand what kind of man could sit across from a detective in a coffee shop in 1964, completely calm, completely composed, and say the things he said. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, officially closed in 1963, just 1 year before the final confrontation between McCauley and Detective Chuck Adamson, sat on a small rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. And it wasn't just a prison. It was the prison, the end of the line. The place you sent the prisoners who couldn't be controlled anywhere else. The place that existed specifically for the people that the entire rest of the federal prison system had given up on. Al Capone was there. Machine Gun Kelly was there. The Birdman of Alcatraz was there. The men who ended up on that island were not ordinary criminals. They were the ones who had proven, repeatedly and definitively, that they could not be managed, could not be rehabilitated, could not be contained by any conventional means. Alcatraz was where you went when you were too dangerous for anywhere else. And Neil McCauley, a man from a small town in Iowa, a man who had an IQ that put him in the top percentile of every federal prisoner in America, Neil McCauley spent 8 years there. 4 of them in isolation. Do you know what isolation does to a person? Do you understand what it means to be alone, truly, completely, almost totally alone, for 4 years? Psychologists who have studied solitary confinement describe it as one of the most psychologically destructive experiences a human being can undergo. The human mind is not built for that kind of isolation. It starts to break down. It starts to turn in on itself. People in prolonged solitary confinement experience hallucinations. They experience paranoia. They experience a kind of cognitive deterioration that can be permanent. And yet, Neil McCauley came out of it. Not broken, not destroyed, not lost. He came out of 4 years of complete isolation in the most feared prison in America, and he came out intact. Maybe more than intact. Maybe, in some strange and terrible way, refined, clarified, the way extreme heat and pressure can turn carbon into diamond. The experience didn't destroy him, it distilled him. And then there's the IQ number. Prison records from Macaulay's time in the federal system show that he scored a 136 on the Army Alpha Intelligence Test. That's not a good score. That's not an impressive score. That is a remarkable score. A score of 136 on a standardized intelligence assessment places a person in the top 2% of the general population. In the context of federal prisoners, in the context of the men who surrounded Neil Macaulay in places like Alcatraz, that score placed him at the absolute top. This is not a dumb man. This is not a brute. This is not the kind of criminal who uses force because he doesn't have anything else. Neil Macaulay was, by every objective measure we have, extraordinarily intelligent. And he chose to use that intelligence for crime. Not because he didn't have other options. A man with a 136 IQ always has other options. But because he chose this. Because for whatever reasons, rooted in whatever experiences we don't have complete access to, this was the life he wanted. And that makes him so much more fascinating. And so much more frightening. Because a violent criminal who isn't very smart is scary. But a violent criminal who is smarter than almost everyone in the room, that's a different category of danger entirely. Let's stay with this for a moment longer. Because I don't want you to just hear the number 25 years and let it slide past you. I want you to actually feel it. Neil Macaulay entered the federal prison system as a young man. He was in and out, in, out, in, out, the revolving door of the American criminal justice system in the mid-20th century. Each time he went back in, the charges were more serious. Each time he went back in, the sentence was longer. Each time, the system escalated its response to him, and each time he escalated right back. By the time he ended up at Alcatraz, the system had essentially concluded that Neil Macaulay was a problem it could not solve with ordinary measures. So it sent him to the place where ordinary measures didn't apply. And here is where we encounter one of the most extraordinary details in this entire story. One of the details that, when I first came across it, made me stop and read it twice, 3 times, just to make sure I was understanding it correctly. While incarcerated at Alcatraz, inside the most secure federal penitentiary in the United States of America, surrounded by some of the most dangerous men in the country, under constant surveillance and monitoring, Neil Macaulay built a distillery, from scrap materials, inside his cell, or inside whatever limited space he had access to, and he used it to produce alcohol, which he then sold or traded within the prison. He was running a criminal enterprise from inside Alcatraz. Let me say that again so it lands. This man was in Alcatraz, not county jail, not a medium security facility, Alcatraz, and he found a way to run an illegal operation from inside it. And the authorities didn't know about it for years. For years. A man with a 136 IQ, 4 years of complete isolation, and the discipline to run a covert business operation from inside the most watched prison in America. This is who Neil Macaulay was. This is the person who walked out of those prison gates in 1962 and immediately, without missing a beat, without taking a breath, without a single moment of reflection or hesitation, went back to work. Because for Neil Macaulay, there was no version of walking away. There was no straight life waiting for him. There was no honest job, no small apartment, no quiet retirement. There was only the work, and the work was all he had ever truly been good at. Before we move forward, before we get to the heists and the detective and the coffee shop and the final score, we need to understand something about who Neil Macaulay was at his core. About what drove him, about what made him different from other criminals, not just in terms of intelligence and skill, but in terms of his fundamental orientation toward life. In the movie and in reality, Neil Macaulay operated by a philosophy, a code, a set of principles so clean and so total that they bordered on the ascetic. The word ascetic comes from the Greek. It describes a person who has deliberately stripped their life of anything unnecessary, any pleasure, any comfort, any attachment that isn't absolutely essential. Monks are ascetics. Certain soldiers are ascetics. And in his own dark way, Neil Macaulay was an ascetic. The movie gives us this in the famous line, "Don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner." 30 seconds. Everything you own, everything you love, everyone you care about, all of it has to be something you can leave in 30 seconds. Because the moment you can't, the moment there's something you can't walk away from, that thing becomes a liability. That thing becomes the crack in the armor. That thing becomes the thing that gets you caught. Did the real Neil McCauley actually say this? We don't have that exact quote on record. But everything we know about how he operated, everything we know about how he lived, everything we know about the choices he made, it all points to a man who genuinely believed this, who genuinely lived it, who had been refined by 25 years of prison and 4 years of isolation into a person who had no room in his life for anything he couldn't walk away from. No family we know of, no long-term relationships we know of, no home in the conventional sense, no community, no church, no neighborhood where people knew his name and asked after him. Just the crew, the plan, the score, and the next score after that. This is what made him dangerous. Not just his intelligence, not just his planning, but his total, complete, almost inhuman capacity to separate himself from anything that would slow him down or tie him in place. Because at the end of the day, law enforcement's greatest tool against criminals isn't surveillance. It isn't forensics. It isn't even informants. It's attachment. It's the wife or the girlfriend or the kid or the mother or the friend that the criminal can't walk away from. It's the thing they love that becomes the lever that law enforcement uses to pry their lives open. And Neil McCauley had removed every one of those levers. He had stripped his life down to bare metal. And that made him almost impossible to catch. Almost. Every great story needs two sides. And this story has them. Because at the same moment that Neil McCauley was walking out of prison in 1962, already thinking about the next job, already assembling the next crew, already mapping out the next score, there was a man on the other side of this story who was already waiting for him. His name was Chuck Adamson. Detective Chuck Adamson. Chicago Police Department. Major Crime Unit. Now, if Neil McCauley is the real Neil McCauley, then Chuck Adamson is the real Vincent Hanna. He is the cop. He is the other half of the coffee shop scene. He is the man who chased McCauley for years, who surveilled him, who tracked him, who ultimately shot him 6 times in a parking lot on the southwest side of Chicago on March 25, 1964. He is the man who then spent the next 2 decades trying to figure out how to turn everything he experienced into a movie. Because Chuck Adamson is also, and this is the part people forget, the man who told Michael Mann the story. Without Chuck Adamson, there is no Heat. Without Chuck Adamson, there is no coffee shop scene. Without Chuck Adamson sitting down with a filmmaker and saying, "Here's what really happened," there is no movie. No Al Pacino, no Robert De Niro, no "you're sitting across from me" conversation that film students have been analyzing for 30 years. Everything, all of it, flows through Chuck Adamson. But before he became the man who told the story, he was the man who lived it. And we need to understand what it was like to be him, chasing Neil McCauley through the streets of Chicago in 1962, 1963, and 1964. Here is something that, when you really think about it, is almost unbelievable. Before Neil McCauley was even released from prison in 1962, Chuck Adamson already had a hunch about him. Not based on anything McCauley had done yet. Not based on any crime he'd committed after his release, because he hadn't been released yet. But based on everything Adamson knew about who this man was, how he operated, what made him tick, Adamson looked at the file, looked at the record, looked at the intelligence score and the Alcatraz time and the history of organized, methodical criminal activity, and he knew. He knew that the moment Neil McCauley walked out of that prison, he was going back to work. He knew it the way a good detective knows things, not from evidence exactly, but from a kind of pattern recognition that comes from spending years studying the way criminals think and move and decide. Adamson had seen enough of the world to know that a man like McCauley, this specific combination of intelligence, discipline, and total commitment to a criminal life, doesn't just stop. Doesn't just decide one day that enough is enough, that the straight life looks appealing, that maybe it's time to get a regular job and settle down somewhere. Men like McCauley don't have that gear. It's not in them. Not because they can't imagine it, they're smart enough to imagine it, but because something in them, something deep and fixed and probably formed very early, has simply never wanted it. So Adamson started watching. Before McCauley even hit the streets, he placed McCauley under surveillance, round-the-clock surveillance, the kind that takes serious manpower and serious resources and a serious level of departmental commitment, the moment McCauley was released. Every move, every contact, every location, every person McCauley spoke to, every place he visited, every pattern he established. Adamson was watching all of it, cataloging it, building a picture of what Macaulay was doing and who he was doing it with and what he was building toward. And Macaulay knew. Of course he knew. A man with a 136 IQ, who had spent 25 years navigating prison politics and federal surveillance, doesn't miss the fact that he's being tailed. He felt it. He knew it. And in a strange way, a way that the movie captures almost perfectly, because Michael Mann had the benefit of talking to Adamson directly, in a strange way it didn't bother him. Because it was part of the game. It was the nature of the thing. You do the crime, the cop watches you. That's how it works. Both men knew it. Both men accepted it. And both men played it out with a kind of professionalism, a kind of mutual respect that was almost chivalric in its formality. That mutual respect, that sense of two men who are playing by the rules of a game they both understand completely, is what makes the coffee shop scene work in the movie. And it's what made the real coffee shop scene work in real life. But before we get there, we need to talk about what Macaulay was actually doing during those 2 years. We need to talk about the heists. The first thing Neil Macaulay did when he got out of prison was get to work. Not in any visible way. Not in any way that would draw attention or give Adamson anything to act on. The work happened quietly, methodically, below the surface. It started with people, with contacts, with the slow, careful process of finding the right men for the right jobs. Because here's something that separates the top-tier criminal operators from the rest. Anybody can rob somebody. Anybody with a gun and a desperation can walk into a place and take what they want. That's not skill. That's violence. And violence is messy and unpredictable and, above all, expensive in terms of exposure, in terms of witnesses, in terms of the level of police response it brings down on you. The skilled operators, the ones who last, the ones who build careers out of this instead of getting caught on the first job, they don't rely on violence. They rely on planning, on research, on knowing everything about a target before they ever move on it, on having the right people in the right positions, each person doing exactly what they're supposed to do, nothing more and nothing less, on getting in, getting what they came for, and getting out before anyone really understands what just happened. Neil Macaulay was that kind of operator, and he needed that kind of crew. We know that Macaulay's crew is believed to have committed at least 6 robberies in the Chicago area between his release in 1962 and his death in 1964. 6 robberies in approximately 2 years. That's a disciplined pace, not frantic, not desperate, not driven by immediate need. Calculated, spaced out. Each one planned, each one executed, each one designed to generate income while minimizing exposure. The specific details of each individual robbery are not fully documented in the historical record. But what we do know, what Adamson told Mann, what Mann incorporated into the screenplay, what the actual police records from the time suggest, is that Macaulay's crew operated at an exceptional level. They were not amateurs. They were not improvising. They were professionals in the truest sense of that word, doing a job they had trained for and refined over years. And the specific detail that most clearly illustrates this, the detail that made it directly into the movie, almost word for word, almost scene for scene, is the diamond-tip drill bits. At some point during those 2 years of operation, Macaulay's crew pulled a job that was almost elegant in its conception. Almost beautiful in the way that a perfectly planned military operation can be beautiful, not in spite of its purpose, but because of the precision with which everything was thought through. The target was a shipment of diamond-tip drill bits. Now, diamond-tip drill bits aren't the kind of thing most people think about. They're not glamorous. They're not the kind of thing that shows up in heist movies. You think of gold, of cash, of jewels. You don't think of industrial drilling equipment. But that's exactly the point. That's exactly why it was a perfect target. Diamond-tip drill bits are valuable. Extremely valuable. And unlike cash, which can be traced, which has serial numbers, which can be marked, industrial equipment like this is much harder to track once it's been moved. You sell it to the right buyer, someone in construction or mining or manufacturing who doesn't ask too many questions, and it's gone. Untraceable. Converted to cash with minimal exposure. But here's the part that is truly extraordinary. Here's the part that tells you everything about how Neil Macaulay's mind worked. He didn't just know what the target was. He knew when it was going to be delivered. He knew the route it was going to take. He knew the precise window during which the shipment would be most vulnerable, after it had left the supplier, before it reached the manufacturer. He intercepted it in transit. Think about what that requires. Think about what kind of intelligence gathering, what kind of reconnaissance, what kind of sustained research and planning that takes. You have to know who's shipping the product. You have to know who they're shipping it to. You have to know the timeline. You have to know the route. You have to know the vehicle. You have to know the level of security. And then you have to figure out exactly the right moment, not too early, not too late, when the shipment is exposed. This isn't a smash and grab. This isn't a robbery. This is a military operation. This is the kind of planning that generals do before battles. And Macaulay did it for a shipment of drill bits in Chicago in 1963 or so, with no computer, no internet, no GPS, no digital surveillance, just legwork and intelligence and a mind that saw angles that other people didn't see. This is why Michael Mann wanted to make a movie about him. Not because Macaulay was violent, not because his crimes were spectacular in scale, but because the way he thought, the way his mind operated, was genuinely, almost frustratingly admirable. Even as you know you shouldn't admire it, even as you know what it cost. All of this was happening under Adamson's eyes. Or at least Adamson was watching as much as he could. Because here's the reality of surveilling someone like Neil Macaulay. It's not like watching someone who doesn't know they're being watched. Macaulay knew. He assumed it. He operated as if Adamson was watching every single thing he did. And he planned accordingly. So what you have is this extraordinary dynamic. A cop who knows that a criminal is building towards something, watching and waiting and gathering information, but unable to act because he doesn't have enough yet. And a criminal who knows the cop is watching, and who is planning so carefully, moving so cleanly, that he gives the cop almost nothing to act on. It's a chess game, and both men are playing at an extremely high level. Adamson's unit was tracking Macaulay's movements, tracking his associates, building a picture of who the crew was and what they were capable of. And as the months went by, as the picture got clearer, one thing became apparent. Macaulay was building towards something significant. Something bigger than the small-scale jobs he'd been running. Something that was going to require a serious law enforcement response. And then the intelligence started coming in about the department store. The informant's tip came in sometime in 1963. The details are specific enough to have made it into Mann's script almost intact. The crew was going to hit Weibalt's. Weibalt's was a department store chain in Chicago. Well-established, well-known, a regular fixture of the city's retail landscape. And on the night Macaulay's crew had chosen, a night that followed a payday, a night when the cash intake from the day's business would be sitting in the safe, that department store safe would be full. The plan was to hit it at night, after hours, after everyone had gone home. The store would be empty, the security minimal, and the safe, heavy with the day's accumulated cash, would be waiting. It was a clean plan. The kind of plan that Macaulay specialized in. Target selected for maximum return, minimum exposure. Timing chosen to eliminate human variables. Execution designed to be fast, quiet, and complete. But Adamson got the tip before they moved. And this is where the story becomes something almost cinematic, even before the movie existed. Because what happened next, in real life, is a sequence so perfectly constructed that Mann could lift it almost directly into the screenplay without changing anything meaningful. In the days before the planned burglary, Adamson's unit picked up intelligence that Macaulay and members of his crew were conducting a reconnaissance of the target. A dry run. This is standard operating procedure for a professional crew. Before you ever move on a target, you visit it. Multiple times if possible. You go as a customer, as a delivery driver, as a pedestrian passing by. You look at everything. You clock the exits. You clock the sight lines. You note where the security is, where the cameras are, where the staff tends to be positioned. You count the cars in the parking lot at the time you plan to hit the place. You look at the lighting. You memorize the layout. And Macaulay did all of this with the thoroughness you'd expect from a man who had a 136 IQ and 25 years of experience to draw on. He noted the layout of the parking lot. He looked at how many cars were present and where they were parked. He clocked the store window displays because even something as seemingly trivial as a window display can tell you something about the interior layout, about where the stock rooms are, about how the staff moves through the space. He saw everything, and Adamson watched him see it. Think about what that moment feels like from Adamson's side. You're watching one of the most capable criminals you've ever encountered, calmly and methodically building a perfect picture of a target that you know he's about to hit. And you can't move on him yet, because he hasn't done anything. He's walked around a department store. He's looked at things. None of that is a crime. None of that is arrest-worthy. You have to wait. You have to let him get close enough that you can catch him in the act, and then you have to be in position when it happens. Adamson set up the trap. He assigned officers to every exit of the building. Hidden, out of sight. Every point where a person could enter or leave the store had a cop on it, positioned with enough concealment that they wouldn't be visible unless you were specifically looking for them. Ready. The night of the planned robbery arrived. Adamson was in position. His team was in position. The trap was set. And then Macaulay walked up to the building. He walked up to the building. And he stopped. He just stopped. Stood there for a moment. Looking. Not at anything in particular or at everything in particular, it's hard to say. But something was wrong. Something in the scene, some detail in the environment that was slightly off, slightly not right, slightly different from what it should have been. Something triggered the instinct. Something fired the alarm in that extraordinary, hyper-aware mind. And he walked away. He didn't run. Running would have confirmed that something was wrong, would have confirmed that he knew the cops were there. He just walked away, calmly, deliberately, with the same measured pace with which he'd arrived. And he didn't go back. Adamson later talked about this moment. He talked about the discipline it took. Because here's what you have to understand. Macaulay had spent weeks planning this job. He'd done the reconnaissance. He'd mapped the exits. He'd timed the employees. He'd done everything right. And in that moment, standing in front of a building that represented weeks of planning and a significant payday, he walked away. Because something felt wrong. And for Neil Macaulay, a feeling was enough. You didn't need proof. You didn't need confirmation. If something felt wrong, it was wrong. And you walked away. Because no score is worth your freedom. No score is worth the years in a cell. You walk away, you find another target, and you do this job the right way. What triggered the instinct? Adamson later reflected on this. And the detail he offered is almost painful in its simplicity. One of the cops waiting in position made a noise. A small noise. Maybe a shuffle of a foot. Maybe a sound of equipment. Maybe a breath that came at the wrong moment. Something tiny. Something that most people, most criminals would have dismissed or not even registered. Macaulay registered it. And he was gone. This moment made its way into man's screenplay. The awareness, the instinct, the ability to read an environment so precisely that even the smallest wrong detail sounds an alarm, that made it into the movie almost exactly as it happened in real life. Because man understood that this was the key to who Macaulay was. Not the violence. Not the skill with weapons. The awareness. The absolute, almost supernatural awareness. Adamson later spoke with what sounded like genuine admiration about this moment. Here was a man who was trying to arrest Macaulay, who had spent years chasing him, who would eventually be the one to shoot him, and he was still capable of standing back and recognizing greatness when he saw it. Because that's what it was. In its own dark and terrible way, that instinct, that discipline was a form of greatness. When the thief walked away from a property he'd previously cased when one of the cops waiting for him made a noise, Adamson said, that moment made it into man's screenplay, and it should have, because it's the purest expression of who Neil Macaulay was. A man so committed to his craft, so disciplined in his execution, that he could walk away from weeks of planning and thousands of dollars without hesitation, based on nothing but a feeling and a sound. That is not a criminal. That is a craftsman. A very, very dangerous craftsman. Adamson and his team emerged from their positions to find an empty parking lot and a department store that had never been touched. Macaulay was gone. The job hadn't happened. And there was nothing legally, operationally, in terms of actual criminal evidence, nothing that Adamson could do about it. Because Macaulay had been right there. And he had walked away. And walking away from a place you've looked at is not a crime. This is one of the most frustrating realities of law enforcement work. You can watch someone. You can know what they're planning. You can be positioned and ready. And if the target is smart enough, if the target is disciplined enough, they can step to the edge of the line and then step back, and there is nothing you can do. The law doesn't punish thoughts. It doesn't punish intent. punishes actions, and Macaulay had not acted. So Adamson went back to watching, went back to waiting, went back to the slow, painstaking work of surveillance and intelligence gathering and building a case that would be solid enough at the right moment to actually hold. And Macaulay went back to planning. Both men knew the game wasn't over. Both men knew that sooner or later, there would be another job. And this time, if Adamson was in position, Macaulay wouldn't walk away in time. But before that happened, before the final score and the final confrontation and the final parking lot, there was a coffee shop. And a conversation that neither man would forget. I need you to stop whatever you're doing right now and pay complete attention. Not because what I'm about to tell you is difficult or complicated. It's actually very simple, but it's important in a way that's hard to explain until you hear it. And I want you to hear it the right way. The most famous scene in Heat, the scene that people talk about when they talk about this movie, the scene that every film critic mentions, the scene that cinematography teachers use in classrooms, the scene that De Niro and Pacino fans consider the pinnacle of what it looks like when two generational talents share a single frame, that scene is real. It happened. Not something like it. Not a version of it. Not an adapted, dramatized, Hollywoodized interpretation of something that kind of happened. The actual scene. The actual meeting. An actual detective and an actual criminal sitting across from each other in an actual place, having an actual conversation, saying actual words that we actually know. The year was 1964. The place was a coffee shop in Chicago. And the conversation went like this. Chuck Adamson invited Neil Macaulay to have a cup of coffee. Think about what that means. Think about how extraordinary that is. This is a detective, a member of the Chicago Police Department's major crime unit. A man who has been surveilling this criminal for months. A man who knows that this criminal has been running a crew and planning robberies and pulling off sophisticated heists, and he invites him to coffee. Not as a tactic, not as a setup, not as an arrest strategy, just to talk. Because Adamson was that kind of cop, and Macaulay was that kind of criminal. And both of them understood that there was something between them that was beyond the usual adversarial relationship, beyond cop and robber, beyond hunter and prey. There was a kind of recognition between them, a mutual acknowledgement of what the other one was. You don't invite someone you don't respect to coffee. And Adamson respected Macaulay. Not his choices, not his crimes, not the path he'd chosen or the people he'd hurt along the way, but the man himself, the intelligence, the discipline, the absolute mastery of a craft, even if that craft was one that Adamson had devoted his career to stopping. And Macaulay said yes. Of course he said yes, because Macaulay respected Adamson right back. Because Macaulay was smart enough to know that the cop who had been watching him all this time wasn't ordinary. That he was dealing with someone who was genuinely good at his job, who was genuinely committed, who wasn't going to make it easy. And you don't refuse coffee from someone like that. So they sat down. Two men. A table. Coffee. Chicago, 1964. And here, as best as we know it, as Adamson himself recounted it, as it was captured and preserved and eventually told to Michael Mann, here is what they said. Adamson spoke first. Why don't you go somewhere else and cause trouble? That's it. That's the opening line. Not a threat. Not a legal warning. Not a formal statement of law enforcement intent. Just a suggestion. Almost casual. Almost friendly. Go somewhere else. Do this somewhere else. Be someone else's problem somewhere else. I know what you are, and I know what you're going to do, and I'm asking you, one man to another, to do it somewhere I don't have to be the one who has to deal with it. Macaulay heard it, considered it, and then he answered, you realize that one day you're going to be taking down a score, and I'm going to be there. Let that sit for a second. You realize that one day you're going to be taking down a score, and I'm going to be there. This is not a threat in the conventional sense. It's not bluster. It's not bravado. It's a statement of fact, delivered with the flat, affectless certainty of a man who has calculated probabilities and arrived at a conclusion. He's telling Adamson, I see where this is going. I know how this ends. You know how this ends. One day you're going to come for me at the right moment on the right job, and you're going to be in position, and I'm going to be there. And we both know what happens then. Adamson met that with equal directness. Well, look at the other side of the coin. I might have to eliminate you. Not arrest. Eliminate. The word choice matters. because they both know, both men sitting at that table drinking that coffee, they both know that men like Macaulay don't usually get arrested on the final job. They know how these things end. You don't catch someone like Macaulay by sneaking up behind him and putting the cuffs on while he's not looking. You catch him in the act. And in the act means guns. And guns mean people get shot. And men like Macaulay, with everything to lose, don't go quietly. Adamson wasn't threatening Macaulay. He was informing him, calmly, professionally, as one craftsman to another. This is the possible outcome. I may have to eliminate you. I'm telling you now so you know. And then Adamson stood up. And as he left, he said the final thing. I'm sure we'll meet again. Two men. Both knowing everything. Both saying it out loud. Both completely okay with it. That's not fiction. That's not a movie. That's real life. And it's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever come across in years of researching these kinds of stories. Because think about what it takes to have that conversation. Think about what you have to be as a human being to sit across from the man who is going to try to take you down and say, yes, I know, and I'm still not stopping. Think about what it takes to be the cop in that conversation, to look at a man you've been chasing for years, a man you genuinely respect, a man who has done nothing but outmaneuver you at every turn, and say calmly, without anger or bitterness, I might have to kill you, and mean it. Michael Mann described this meeting in a way that I think is worth sharing. He said, there was a rapport between them, a sense of, you're a regular fella. But at the same time, Neil Macaulay was something of a sociopath who'd kill you as soon as look at you, and Charlie Adamson wasn't. That's the key distinction. Adamson was not a sociopath. Adamson felt things. Adamson had a life outside of this chase, family, relationships, a world that extended beyond the game he was playing with Macaulay. For Adamson, this was his job, his vocation, something he cared about deeply and did with total commitment. But it wasn't everything. For Macaulay, it might have been everything. The work, the planning, the execution, the crew, this was his whole life. There was no outside of it. And that made him capable of things that Adamson wasn't. That made him free in a way that Adamson wasn't. And that made him ultimately unreachable in a way that guaranteed that this story could only end one way. I'm sure we'll meet again. They did. 3 months later, in a parking lot. And it ended exactly the way both of them had said it would. In the movie, the equivalent scene happens in a diner on the Pacific Coast Highway. Two legends, two giants, De Niro and Pacino, sitting across a table as the Pacific Ocean rolls in behind them. And the conversation they have is longer, more elaborated, more psychologically developed than what Adamson and Macaulay actually said. Mann gave both characters more to say, more room to breathe, more texture and dimension. And it's extraordinary. It's one of the greatest scenes in cinema. Watching it still gives you something that very few movies give you, that feeling that you are witnessing something real, something true, something that matters. But here's what I want you to know. The real conversation was better. Not in terms of length, not in terms of psychological depth, but in terms of pure, undiluted truth. The real conversation was 4 sentences, and those 4 sentences contained everything that needed to be said. Go somewhere else. I'll be there when you come. I might have to kill you. I'm sure we'll meet again. That's a complete world in 4 sentences. That's everything you need to know about both of these men. That's as honest as any two people have ever been with each other about the path they were both walking and the place they were both walking toward. Mann had to expand it because he was making a 3-hour movie. He had to give audiences enough time in the scene to feel the weight of it, to understand who these men were, to care about both of them enough that the ending would hurt. And he did that beautifully. But the real thing, 4 sentences in a coffee shop in Chicago in 1964, is its own kind of perfection. The date was March 25th, 1964, and everything was in position. On one side, Neil Macaulay, 50 years old at this point, or very close to it, depending on exactly when this went down relative to his 1914 birthday. A man who had spent more than half his life in prison. A man who had run a criminal operation from inside Alcatraz. A man who had walked away from a perfectly set trap at a department store because one cop made one small sound. A man who had sat across a table from the detective chasing him and said, with perfect clarity and perfect calm, exactly what was going to happen. On the other side, Chuck Adamson, a detective who had been chasing this man for 2 years, who had watched him for 2 years, who had sat across from him in a coffee shop and told him he might have to eliminate him, who was, in the language of his profession, closing in. And between them, a grocery store on the southwest side of Chicago, the National Tea Company, and an armored car that was about to make a money drop. Macaulay and his crew had been researching this job for weeks, possibly longer. The target was simple on the surface, as the best targets always are. An armored car made a regular money drop to the National Tea grocery store. On the night in question, the amount would be significant enough to justify the risk, enough to justify the planning, enough to make the job worth doing. Macaulay's crew had tracked the armored car's schedule. They knew the route. They knew the timing. They knew the window, the specific, precise window in which the money would be most vulnerable. They followed the armored truck to the store. They watched it make the drop. And then they moved. And here's where the movie version and the real version diverge in the most dramatic way possible, in a way that is almost funny in a dark and bittersweet kind of way, because it says so much about what Hollywood does to real stories. In Heat, in the movie that made Neil Macaulay famous, in the movie that millions of people have watched and loved and quoted, the final job is a bank robbery. A massive downtown Los Angeles bank robbery for $12 million. It's spectacular. It's cinematic. It involves a professional, military-grade crew, precision timing, high-powered weapons, and a running gun battle through downtown LA that became one of the most praised action sequences in cinema history. In real life, Macaulay and his crew robbed a grocery store and got away with $13,000. $13,000. Not $12 million. $13,000. A grocery store, not a downtown bank. A National Tea Company location on the southwest side of Chicago. And the crew didn't have military-grade weapons, and they didn't have precision timing, and there was no running gun battle through downtown. There was just a robbery. Quick, clean, professional. In and out. Exactly the way Macaulay had always done it. Except this time, Adamson was already there. Here's the thing that makes this final sequence so devastating. In retrospect, Macaulay and his crew didn't know that they'd been found out. They didn't know that the same intelligence network that Adamson had been building for 2 years, the surveillance, the informants, the careful, patient accumulation of information about how this crew operated and what they were building toward, had finally given Adamson what he needed. They didn't know that Adamson and his team were already on the scene, already in position, already waiting. Macaulay's instincts, the same instincts that had saved him at the department store, that had made one small noise enough to make him walk away from a job he'd spent weeks planning. His instincts didn't fire this time. Maybe he was more confident, having pulled off multiple jobs successfully. Maybe the target seemed clean and the planning seemed solid. Maybe he was simply at a point where the job felt right and nothing felt wrong, and there was no noise in the parking lot and no misplaced cop and no reason to stop. Or maybe the instincts did fire and he overrode them. And that's the most human explanation of all. Because even the most disciplined person, at some point, makes the choice to believe what they want to believe. To trust that this time it will be fine. To take the job even when some part of them knows they shouldn't. We'll never know. Macaulay can't tell us. And the only other person who was there, Adamson, can only tell us what he saw from his side of the equation. What Adamson saw was this. Macaulay's gang committed the robbery. They got $13,000. They came out of the store. And Adamson and company were waiting at every exit, blocking every route, giving them nowhere to go. A shootout commenced. Not the cinematic, extended, choreographed battle of downtown Los Angeles that the movie shows us. Not the kind of sequence that film critics write about and aspiring directors study. A real shootout in a parking lot on the southwest side of Chicago, in the middle of an ordinary night in March 1964. 2 of Macaulay's men were killed in the exchange of fire. Macaulay himself tried to run. Of course he did. Because that was the protocol. That was the code. When it goes wrong, you run. You don't stand and fight. You don't try to shoot your way out of a closing perimeter. You run and you run and you run, and if you're fast enough and lucky enough, you get away and you live to fight another day. Neil Macaulay was not fast enough. Chuck Adamson shot him 6 times. And Neil Macaulay, the man from Polk County, Iowa, the man who had spent 25 years in prison, the man who had run illegal operations from inside Alcatraz, The man who had walked away from a perfectly set trap on the strength of a single sound. The man who had sat in a coffee shop and told a detective exactly how this was going to end. Neil McCauley died in a parking lot on the southwest side of Chicago on March 25, 1964. He was 50 years old. More than half of those years had been spent in a cell. And in the end, the man who had lived his entire life by the code of not getting attached to anything, of being willing to walk away in 30 seconds, of never letting anything or anyone become a liability, in the end, what got him was the one thing he couldn't walk away from. The job itself. The work was his identity. The work was his life. And the work killed him. Let's take a moment and put the two versions of this story side by side. Because the comparison is fascinating and it says a lot about both the truth and about Hollywood. In the movie, Neil McCauley and his crew rob a bank for $12 million. It's a perfectly executed job, until it goes wrong in a way that no amount of planning could have prevented. The job gets connected to a murder, which brings Pacino's Vincent Hanna and his entire unit down on them with full resources. The final confrontation happens at LAX. McCauley chooses, in the last moments of the film, to go back and kill a man who betrayed him, knowing that it will get him caught, knowing that it goes against everything he's always lived by, and Hanna is waiting for him. They end up on the tarmac, and Hanna shoots McCauley, and McCauley dies holding Hanna's hand. It's devastating. It's one of the most powerful endings in crime cinema, because the thing that gets McCauley isn't a mistake in the planning. It isn't a cop who was smarter or faster or better. It's attachment. It's the one moment where McCauley couldn't walk away. The one thing he couldn't leave in 30 seconds. In reality, in Chicago in 1964, it's simpler, and maybe more honest. A grocery store, $13,000. Adamson already in position. A shootout in a parking lot. 6 bullets. And it's over. No attachment. No choice to go back for someone. Just a job that went wrong because the intelligence ran out before the caution did. But both versions end the same way. Both versions of Neil McCauley die because ultimately the game catches up. Because you can be the smartest person in the room and still not be smart enough. Because you can plan for everything except the thing you don't know about. Because no matter how good you are, no matter how disciplined, no matter how aware, the house always wins eventually. That's the truth of both stories. The movie version and the real version. And maybe that's why Mann's film resonates so deeply, even decades later. Because the emotional truth of it, the inevitability of it, matches the actual truth. The details are different. The scale is different. The drama is amplified. But the core of it, the thing it's really about, is exactly right. After Neil McCauley died in that parking lot in March 1964, Chuck Adamson went back to work. He kept doing his job, chasing criminals, building cases, working the major crime unit for years afterward. He was good at it. He remained good at it. And eventually, in the way that careers do, it wound down. He retired. And then, sometime after retiring from police work, Chuck Adamson did something that, depending on how you look at it, was either very simple or very extraordinary. He met Michael Mann, and he told him everything. Michael Mann is one of the most meticulous filmmakers who has ever worked in Hollywood. That's not a controversial statement. That's not flattery. It's just a fact that is demonstrable in every single movie he has ever made. The research, the attention to detail, the absolute insistence on authenticity in the sound design, in the photography, in the performance, in the logistics of how things actually work. Mann is not a director who guesses. He's a director who finds out. When Adamson told Mann the story, when he sat down with the filmmaker and walked him through the whole thing, from McCauley's release from prison to the department store to the coffee shop to the grocery store to the parking lot, Mann asked for permission to base a screenplay on it. And then he went to work. Here's a timeline that blows people's minds when they hear it. Mann wrote the first draft of Heat in 1979. The movie came out in 1995. That is 16 years between the first draft and the theatrical release. 16 years of Mann living with this story, refining it, finding the right angle, finding the right cast, finding the right city, finding the right visual language to make it work. That's not a movie that got made quickly. That's not a Hollywood studio product ground out to hit a release date. That's a filmmaker who was genuinely obsessed with a story and who refused to put it in front of an audience until it was right. The first version of the story was actually made for television in 1989, a movie called LA Takedown, also directed by Mann, which was essentially a rough draft of Heat. If you've seen it, you know it's fine. It's a competent TV movie, but it's clearly not what the story needed to be. Mann knew it wasn't right, and he spent 6 more years after that getting it right. When Mann finally had the right script, the right cast, the right everything to go into production on the theatrical version, he didn't just hand the actors the script and start shooting. That's not how he works. He took Val Kilmer, Tom Sizemore, and Robert De Niro to Folsom State Prison. Folsom State Prison in California, one of the oldest and most storied prisons in America, a place that has housed some of the most dangerous men in the state's history. He took 3 of his principal cast members to that prison, and he had them sit down with actual career criminals. Men who had done what Macaulay had done. Men who had built crews and planned heists and lived the professional criminal life from the inside. And these men, the actual criminals, the real Macaulays of the world, told the actors what it was like. Not what it looks like from the outside. Not what Hollywood thinks it looks like. What it actually feels like, from the inside, when you've made the choice to live this way. What it feels like to plan a job. What it feels like in the moment before you move. What it feels like after. What drives you. What keeps you going. What you tell yourself when you're lying in the dark at night and you know what you're walking toward. That's method research. That's the kind of thing that shows up on screen in ways the audience can feel even if they can't specifically identify it. That's why De Niro's Macaulay in the movie feels so real. Not because De Niro is imitating something he studied from the outside. Because he went inside, as far as a civilian can go inside, and tried to actually understand it. But the research didn't stop there. For the tactical sequences, the robbery, the armored car heist, the downtown shootout, Mann brought in a man named Andy McNabb. British Ex-Special Air Service, ex-SAS. For those who don't know, the SAS is the British equivalent of Delta Force or SEAL Team 6, Elite Special Operations, the kind of soldiers who do the jobs that regular soldiers can't be sent to do. Highly trained, highly skilled, completely professional. McNabb took the cast and the crew through weapons training that was, by all accounts, unlike anything that had been done for a Hollywood production before. Not just how to hold a gun or how to shoot it for the camera. How to move with a weapon. How to cover a room. How to advance and retreat under fire. How to work as a unit. How to coordinate fire and movement with a team. How to think tactically in a high-stress, high-danger situation. The training was so thorough and so effective that the result, the downtown shootout sequence in Heat, the one that runs for almost 11 minutes and involves hundreds of rounds of ammunition fired on a closed-off set of downtown Los Angeles streets, the result was so realistic, so tactically accurate, that something extraordinary happened. The United States Army started using it. Let me say that again because it bears repeating. Sections of Heat, a Hollywood movie, a fictional crime drama, were incorporated into training materials for new U.S. Army soldiers. Not as entertainment, not as something to watch on a Friday night, as actual training, because the tactics shown in that sequence, the way the actors playing criminals in a movie move and communicate and cover each other and control a street, were accurate enough, realistic enough, effective enough that the Army found them instructive. A movie trained an army, or at least helped train one. That's not something you can say about many films. And then there was the cast. Robert De Niro as Neil Macaulay. The choice almost seems obvious in retrospect, but nothing about it was obvious at the time. De Niro had spent the 1980s and early 1990s doing work that was celebrated but that hadn't quite reached the same heights as his 1970s films. He was still great, he is always great, but the consensus had settled around the idea that maybe his absolute peak was behind him. Heat proved that wrong. Completely, definitively wrong. Al Pacino as Vincent Hanna, the fictional version of Chuck Adamson. And here's a detail that people always love. This was the first time De Niro and Pacino shared the screen in an actual scene together. They'd both been in The Godfather Part 2, but they shared no scenes. They'd been friends for years. They'd been making movies in the same city, in the same era, for decades. And somehow, in all of that time, they'd never actually been in a scene together. Until Heat. Until that diner. Until You're Sitting Across From Me. Until two men who both knew everything sat across a table and said it out loud. The scene took months to happen. Mann had the script right, he had the set right, he had the camera positions right, and then he basically let De Niro and Pacino do what De Niro and Pacino do, find the truth in a scene through complete, total, fearless commitment. What came out of it is one of the most analyzed scenes in cinema history. Film students write about it. Critics wrote about it in 1995 and they're still writing about it now. And the reason it works the way it works, the reason it has the weight that it has, is because it's not fiction. Not completely. The words are Mann's. The setting is his. The characters are his versions of real people. But the truth at the center of it, the truth of two exceptional men acknowledging each other across a line that neither of them can cross, that's real. That's Chuck Adamson and Neil McCauley in a coffee shop in 1964. That truth is what gives the scene its gravity. You can feel it even if you don't know the history. You can feel that this isn't just actors talking. That there's something underneath it that's actually true. And while we're talking about the cast, because this story deserves the full treatment, let's take a moment for Val Kilmer. Because Val Kilmer in Heat is one of the great underappreciated performances of the 1990s. His character, Chris Shiherlis, is the one who has the thing that Macaulay's Code says he shouldn't have. He has the attachment. He has the wife he can't walk away from, even knowing that she's going to be his downfall, even knowing that she's the crack in the armor, even knowing that Macaulay's 30-second rule exists for exactly this reason. Shiherlis knows all of this, he understands the code, and he can't follow it. Because she's real to him in a way that the code isn't. Kilmer plays all of that without saying most of it. It's in the way he holds himself, the way he looks at his wife in the scenes they share, the way there's a softness there that doesn't appear anywhere else in the movie. He's as professional as any of them when the job is happening. And then the job stops and he becomes human again, and you can see exactly why he's going to get caught. For the research he brought to this role after going to Folsom Prison, after working with McNabb on the weapons training, Kilmer apparently became so skilled with his weapon that the other actors on set were genuinely impressed. There's a story that his reload and manipulation of his rifle in the downtown shootout sequence happened so fast and so cleanly that it had to be slowed down in post-production for the audience to even see it. Because if they showed it in real time, it looked fake. It was too fast to look real. The training worked, and the movie worked, and Val Kilmer's performance in it deserves more credit than it usually gets. One of the things that makes Heat not just a great crime movie but a great film, period, full stop, in any genre, is what Michael Mann does with Los Angeles. Chicago is where this story actually happened. Chicago is the real Macaulay's city, the streets he walked, the neighborhoods he knew, the places where his crew operated and planned and ultimately fell. But Mann moved the story to Los Angeles. And in doing so, he discovered something that made the movie both more universal and more specific at the same time. Los Angeles, in Mann's version of it, is a city of surfaces. Gorgeous, gleaming, eternally lit surfaces that conceal what's underneath. The freeways, the glass towers, the Pacific Ocean shimmering in the background of every other shot. The city as a kind of beautiful lie, presenting an image of possibility and abundance that papers over everything dark and desperate that happens beneath it. And into that city, Mann places two men who are defined by what's underneath, who are stripped of surfaces, who don't do beautiful lies. Macaulay lives in a house with no furniture, literally almost no furniture, because furniture is attachment, furniture is commitment, furniture is something you'd have to leave behind in 30 seconds and it would slow you down by 30 seconds. The empty rooms of his house are the most honest thing in the movie. They are exactly what he is. Hannah, on the other hand, has all the furniture. Has the family, the wife, the stepchild, the house, the California sunshine, and the California lifestyle. And none of it is real. Or rather, all of it is less real than the job. Less real than the pursuit. He's present for none of it, no matter how much he tries. Because the pursuit is the only thing that actually requires him. These are two men who are mirror images of each other, living in the same city, on opposite sides of a line that neither of them chose to stand where they stand on. Mann and his cinematographer, Dante Spinati, made choices in this movie that were, at the time, somewhat unconventional and that have since been recognized as genuinely influential. The most distinctive visual element of Heat is its use of a specific kind of color palette, cold blues, steely grays, the washed-out palette of nighttime Los Angeles under sodium vapor lights. The movie almost never looks warm. Even the daylight scenes have a quality of distance, of remove, of light that illuminates without comforting. This was deliberate. Mann wanted the visual language of the film to reflect what both his protagonists experience internally, a world they can see clearly, can navigate masterfully, but from which they are fundamentally disconnected. The warmth has been taken out, not because it was never there, but because the life these men have chosen has removed it. The nighttime cinematography, in particular, is extraordinary. The shots of freeways at night, of the city lights sprawling across the Los Angeles basin, of De Niro standing at the edge of the ocean, all of these are images that have become part of the visual vocabulary of a certain kind of American cinema. Images that people recognize even if they don't know where they're from. And all of it is in service of the same story, the same true story. Two men, one on each side of a line, who meet in the middle for a cup of coffee and then go back to their corners and wait for the thing that's coming. And then there's the sound. The downtown Los Angeles shootout in Heat, the sequence that begins after the bank robbery goes wrong and ends in a running gun battle through the streets of downtown, is widely considered one of the best executed action sequences in cinema history. And a significant part of why it's as effective as it is comes down to the sound design. For the sequence, Mann and his sound team used live ammunition fired on location. Not blanks, not sound effects added in post-production, but actual weapons fired in the actual streets of downtown Los Angeles. The sound of the gunfire in Heat is not what you hear in most movies. Most movie gunfire has been processed, equalized, compressed, made to sound bigger and more dramatic than real gunfire actually is. Real gunfire, recorded in an actual urban environment with real acoustics, the way it echoes off buildings, the way it travels down canyons of concrete and glass, the way it overlaps and compounds and fills space sounds different. More chaotic, more overwhelming, more real. The audience that saw Heat in theaters in 1995 often reported a physical reaction to that sequence. A visceral, bodily response to the sound of it. Because it didn't sound like movie gunfire. It sounded like what you imagine real gunfire in a city street sounds like. And that effect, that disorientation between the safety of a movie theater and the overwhelming reality of what the screen was showing and the speakers were playing, that's part of why the sequence has never been equaled. It's been imitated, many times, by many directors who admired it. But it hasn't been equaled. Because you can copy the technique, but you can't copy the decision to actually do it this way. You can't copy the obsession. You can't copy Michael Mann's specific brand of insistence that it be exactly, precisely, uncompromisingly right. I told you at the beginning of this video that this story has a full circle moment. That it rippled outward in ways nobody could have predicted. That real people paid for it with their lives. It's time to tell you about that. February 28th, 1997, North Hollywood, California. Approximately 9:17 in the morning. Two men walked into the Bank of America on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Their names were Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matassarianu. They were heavily armed. They were wearing homemade body armor. And they had a plan. What happened next became one of the longest, most violent, and most consequential police shootouts in American law enforcement history. The North Hollywood shootout, the real one, not a movie, not a dramatization, lasted approximately 44 minutes. Phillips and Matassarianu fired more than 1,100 rounds of ammunition. 12 police officers and 8 civilians were wounded. Both robbers ultimately died, Matassarianu from wounds to his legs, which the body armor didn't cover. Phillips from a gunshot wound to the head, which may have been self-inflicted. The North Hollywood shootout changed American law enforcement. It directly led to changes in police equipment and training. After seeing that their standard 9mm and .38 caliber service weapons were largely ineffective against the robbers' body armor, departments across the country began issuing higher caliber weapons and armor-piercing ammunition as standard equipment. It changed police tactics. It changed how departments think about and prepare for high-casualty, long-duration armed confrontations in urban environments. And it was directly inspired by Heat. When law enforcement searched the home of Larry Phillips Jr. after the shootout, they found a VCR. And in that VCR, they found a tape. Heat. Not just a copy of the movie sitting on a shelf. In the VCR. Meaning he had been watching it recently, perhaps repeatedly. Meaning that as he and Matassarianu planned the Bank of America robbery, as they assembled their weapons and fabricated their body armor and worked out the logistics of how they were going to do this thing, they were watching Heat. They were studying it. They were using it. The tactics they employed in the North Hollywood shootout, the way they moved, the way they suppressed police response with overwhelming firepower, the way they used their body armor to absorb hits and keep advancing, all of it bears the fingerprints of what they saw in that movie. Which means the real Neil McCauley inspired a movie. The movie inspired real criminals. The real criminals carried out a real crime. The real crime changed real police training. And the real police training was itself partly based on the movie, because the movie's tactical accuracy had made it into military and law enforcement training materials. The story became reality, became story, became reality. McCauley to Adamson to Mann to Heat to Phillips and Matasareanu to North Hollywood to police training reform to where? How far does it go? How many times does it circle around? How many stories branch off from this one single man, born in Polk County, Iowa in 1914, who made a choice to be who he was and live the way he lived and die the way he died? There is something genuinely unsettling about this full-circle detail, and I want to be careful about how I frame it, because this isn't exciting or glamorous or cool. People were shot in North Hollywood. Police officers were wounded. 2 men died. The people who lived through that day have not forgotten it. It was real, and it was violent, and it was terrifying. And it happened because 2 men watched a movie about a man who actually lived and actually did those things, and they decided to try to do it themselves. This is the dark side of storytelling. The shadow of it. The part that doesn't get discussed enough when we talk about why certain stories matter. Because stories are not neutral. They don't just sit on a shelf and mean nothing. They go somewhere. They do something. They enter people and they change them, sometimes in ways that are beautiful and sometimes in ways that are terrible and sometimes, as in this case, in ways that are both at once. Heat is a beautiful film. It's a genuine work of art. It honors the complexity of both of its protagonists. It doesn't glamorize crime in a simple-minded way. It shows the cost, the isolation, the inevitable end of a life lived outside the law. It tells a true story with intelligence and care and craft. And 2 men watched it and decided to be McCauley, not realizing or not caring that McCauley died in a parking lot. Not realizing or not caring that the thing the movie is actually about is the impossibility of the life they were trying to emulate. Not realizing or not caring that the real Neil McCauley spent more than half his life in a cell and died at 50 with nothing. They saw the craft. They saw the precision. They saw the movie version, the $12 million score, the cinematic gun battle, the cool professional confidence of De Niro's performance, and they didn't see the rest of it. Which is maybe the most important lesson in this entire story. The real version and the movie version both end the same way. Both versions of McCauley die because the game catches up. But the movie version is so compelling, so beautifully made, so seductive in its portrait of a certain kind of life, that some people watch it and take away only the surface, only the aesthetics, only the part that looks like a path to somewhere, without understanding that the path leads nowhere good. Stories have power, real power, and with that power comes responsibility, for the storyteller and for the audience both. Neil McCauley died in a parking lot on March 25, 1964. He was 50 years old, or close to it. He had spent more than half his life behind bars. He had survived Alcatraz. He had survived 4 years of solitary confinement. He had run an illegal distillery inside the most secure federal prison in America. He had walked away from a perfectly set police trap because one cop made one small noise. He had sat across from the detective chasing him and told him exactly how this was going to end. And then it ended exactly that way. $13,000 from a grocery store. 6 bullets in a parking lot. And a story that would keep going long after he stopped. Chuck Adamson retired. Told Michael Mann the story. Mann spent 16 years making it into the movie it needed to be. Heat came out in 1995 and became one of the most celebrated crime films ever made. De Niro and Pacino had the scene that cinema had been waiting for. A British ex-SAS soldier trained the cast so thoroughly that the U.S. Army used parts of the film for training. And 2 decades after McCauley died in that parking lot, 2 men in North Hollywood watched the movie about him and decided to live it, and discovered too late what McCauley had discovered in 1964. That you can plan everything except the thing you don't know about. This is a complete circle. A closed loop. A story that ate its own tail and then kept going. And the reason I think it matters, the reason I think it's worth 3.5 hours of your attention, is because it's not really about crime. It's about what we choose to be good at, and what the cost is. The movie made Neil Macaulay a legend, a cultural figure, a touchstone for a certain kind of cinema. Robert De Niro's face, in that minimalist house, looking out at the ocean, that's become an icon. That image means something that extends far beyond the specific story it's part of. But the real Neil Macaulay was not an icon. He was a human being. A man who was born in Iowa in 1914 and who made choices and paid the price for them and died at 50 in a parking lot with everything he'd built crumbling around him. He was brilliant. A 136 IQ is not nothing. That's a genuinely exceptional mind. And what he did with it, the planning, the logistics, the discipline, the ability to read a situation so precisely that he could walk away from weeks of work on the strength of a single sound, all of that required a quality of mind that most people don't have. He was genuinely extraordinary in certain very specific ways. But he spent 25 years in a cell. He spent 4 years in isolation. He died at 50 with $13,000 that he never got to spend. He had no family we know of, no home in any real sense, no community, no history of kindness or generosity or love. He stripped his life down to bare metal and then the metal corroded. The movie gives him a redemption arc, a woman he falls in love with, a moment where attachment becomes something beautiful rather than something dangerous. The real Macaulay didn't have that. The real Macaulay walked right up to the edge of the coffee shop conversation and then kept walking, kept planning, kept working, because there was nothing else, because the work was all there was. That's not admirable. That's sad. In a way that doesn't diminish who he was, because he made his choices with full awareness, with that 136 IQ fully operational, but it's sad. Because potential like that, applied differently, might have built something instead of just taking things. We don't know why he chose what he chose. We don't know what happened in those early years in Polk County, Iowa that set him on this path. We don't know if there was a moment where he could have gone a different way and didn't, or whether the path was always going to be this one. We just know where it ended. And knowing where it ended, holding that alongside the legend the movie made of him, feels like the most honest way to remember him. Not as a hero, not as a symbol, as a man. A complicated, brilliant, damaged, extraordinary, ultimately tragic man who lived and made choices and died in a parking lot in Chicago in 1964. The movie made him a legend. The truth makes him human. And humans are always more interesting than legends. Always more worth paying attention to. Always more worth trying to understand. Chuck Adamson deserves a final word. Because without Chuck Adamson, none of this exists. Not the movie. Not this video. Not the conversation about Neil Macaulay that has been happening in film circles and true crime circles and history circles for 30 years. None of it. Adamson shot Macaulay. That's a fact. He fired 6 shots and Macaulay went down and that was the end of it. And Adamson lived with that. Carried it. Not as guilt, necessarily. He was doing his job. He was stopping a criminal who would have killed him if he'd had the chance, but as weight. As the weight of a life, even an antagonistic one, that was ended. And then he found Michael Mann. And he told the story. Not to justify himself or to celebrate what happened. But because the story was real and the story was remarkable and the story deserved to be told. He told Mann about the coffee shop. About the exact words. About the department store and the single noise that made Macaulay walk away. About the surveillance and the planning and the final score and the parking lot. He told him all of it and he gave Mann permission to use it, and then he spent years watching Mann make it into something extraordinary. Adamson consulted on Heat. He was there during production. He saw Al Pacino playing a version of himself, having a version of his conversation, doing a version of his job. And at some point during that process, watching fiction reconstruct reality with such care and precision, he must have had a feeling that is almost impossible to name. The feeling of seeing your own life translated into art. Of watching the true thing become the beautiful thing. He passed away before Heat became the cultural landmark it has become. But the mark he left is permanent. Every time someone watches that coffee shop scene, every time those 4 real sentences find their way into the fictional dialogue, every time the audience feels the weight of 2 men who know exactly where they're going and how it's going to end, that's Adamson. That's the real conversation. That's real life, preserved forever in amber. We owe him the story, and the story is extraordinary. Every great story, told properly, leaves you with questions. Not because the facts are incomplete, we have enough facts, but because facts alone don't exhaust the meaning. There's always something left, some residue of the story that settles in you and keeps working after the story is over. And this story leaves me with several. The first question is the one I keep coming back to. Neil Macaulay had a 136 IQ. He had a mind that, in a different life, under different circumstances, pointed in a different direction, could have built something significant. Could have been a strategist, a planner, an architect of operations in business or the military or any number of other fields where that kind of analytical precision and that kind of discipline would have been genuinely valued and genuinely useful. What do we do with that? What do we do with the recognition that some of the most extraordinary human capabilities sometimes find expression in the darkest places? What does it say about opportunity, about circumstance, about the paths we're given and the paths we choose? I don't have a clean answer. I don't think there is one. But I think the question matters. I think it's worth sitting with the idea that genius doesn't guarantee a good life, and that intelligence without wisdom or direction or care can lead anywhere, including to a parking lot on the southwest side of Chicago at 50 years old, shot 6 times with nothing. The second question is related to the first. Macaulay was extraordinarily disciplined, more disciplined than most people ever become in any domain. The code he lived by, the 30-second rule, the no attachments principle, the constant vigilance, the ability to walk away, required a level of self-mastery that most people who try to achieve it in legitimate contexts, athletes, soldiers, surgeons, spend years developing. And he used that discipline in service of what? Of taking things, of organizing the taking of things, of building nothing, contributing nothing, leaving nothing. Discipline without purpose is just efficiency. And efficiency can be efficient at anything, including destroying things, including hurting people, including living and dying in a way that leaves the world unchanged. Purpose matters. Direction matters. The question of what you're building, not just how you're building it, that matters. And Macaulay never had a satisfying answer to it. He had the how dialed in. He never quite found the why. The third question is the one that's most uncomfortable. Why does Hollywood, why does anyone romanticize this? Why does a story about a man who spent most of his life in prison and died at 50 in a parking lot with $13,000 that he stole from a grocery store become one of the most beloved crime films ever made? Part of the answer is craft. Man made a beautiful film. De Niro gave a transcendent performance. The story has real architecture, real stakes, real human truth at its center. Those things deserve to be celebrated. But part of the answer is something more uncomfortable. There's something in the Macaulay figure, in the stripped-down, attachment-free, absolutely committed professional criminal, that speaks to something a lot of people feel but can't act on. The desire to be that free. The desire to live outside the rules. The desire to be so good at something that the normal considerations don't apply to you. The fantasy of competence so total that consequences become optional. That fantasy is not harmless. The North Hollywood shootout told us that. 2 men who wanted to be Macaulay and found out the hard way what Macaulay actually was. But the fantasy exists. And it exists in people who would never actually cross any line. People who watch Heat in their living rooms and feel something when De Niro looks at the ocean at night, and then go to sleep and wake up the next morning and go to work and live ordinary, decent, nonviolent lives. For most of those people, the fantasy is just a feeling. A response to something in the story that resonates with something in them. And that's okay. That's what fiction is for, to let us feel things safely that would be dangerous to feel unsafely. The line between feeling and doing is everything. And most people, most of the time, stay on the right side of it. But it's worth knowing why the story pulls the way it pulls. Worth being clear-eyed about what exactly is seductive about it and why. Because stories that are seductive without being understood have a way of doing unexpected things to unexpected people. And this one, as we've seen, has done that before. The fourth and final question is perhaps the deepest one. And it's about the code, the 30-second rule, the no attachments principle, the philosophy that Macaulay and the movie version of him lived by so completely. There's a reason that line has become one of the most quoted lines in cinema. Don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. A reason it resonates with people who are not criminals, who will never be criminals, who are just living ordinary lives with ordinary attachments, marriages and children and mortgages and friendships and all the ordinary structures that make ordinary lives feel meaningful. That line resonates because everyone, at some point, understands the burden of attachment, understands that the things you love are also the things that make you vulnerable, that the people you can't live without are also the people who, if you're not careful, become the levers by which the world controls you. Macaulay's solution, cut it all away, be free, be weightless, be unburdened, is not a solution. It's a trade. You trade the vulnerability for the freedom. And you also trade, in the same transaction, every reason to use the freedom for anything worthwhile. Macaulay was free. Completely, totally free. He owed nothing to anyone. He needed nothing from anyone. He was answerable to nothing and no one except his own code. And he used that freedom to die at 50 in a parking lot with $13,000. The attachments, the wife, the child, the friend, the community, the sense of belonging somewhere to something, those are not weaknesses. They're not liabilities, not really. They're the things that make the freedom worth having. They're the things that give the freedom somewhere to go. Without them, freedom is just emptiness, just the ability to move through a world you're not really part of. Macaulay was unreachable. And that unreachability, that total, absolute separateness from everything, is what made him tragic. Not just dangerous, not just effective, tragic, because he was extraordinary in every meaningful sense of the word. And he used that extraordinariness to disappear, to be no one's, to belong nowhere, to leave nothing. The movie understood this. That's why it gave him The Woman, the love story, the glimpse of another life, another possibility, a version of things where the code breaks down just enough to let something real in. And then the movie takes it away because that's what the story demands. But that glimpse, that moment where Macaulay looks at another person and something in him responds, is the most human moment in the film. And the most human moment in the real story too, even if it existed only in a coffee shop conversation with the man who was going to shoot him. The recognition between Macaulay and Adamson, that rapport, that mutual respect, that strange friendship forged between adversaries, might be the closest thing the real Macaulay ever had to connection. And even that ended with 6 bullets. Neil Macaulay spent 25 years in prison, including 8 at Alcatraz, including 4 in complete isolation, including however many months running an illegal distillery from inside the most secure prison in America, because his mind couldn't stop working even when everything else was taken away from him. He came out at 48 years old, more than half his life already spent in a cell, and he didn't hesitate, didn't pause, didn't look around and decide that maybe it was time for something different. He went back to work, because it was the only work he'd ever done, the only world he'd ever really lived in, the only thing that used all of him, the intelligence, the discipline, the awareness, the planning, at full capacity. He built a crew. He pulled at least 6 jobs. He stole diamond-tip drill bits in transit, which is the kind of crime that requires the kind of mind that generals have. He walked away from a department store when one cop moved at the wrong moment, which is the kind of discipline that most people will never achieve in anything, let alone in a situation where thousands of dollars are on the line. He sat in a coffee shop with the man who was hunting him and said 4 sentences that told the whole story. 4 sentences. And then he got up and walked out and he kept going and he kept working and he didn't stop. And on March 25, 1964, in a parking lot on the southwest side of Chicago, it ended. The way he'd said it would. The way they'd both known it would. 6 bullets from Chuck Adamson's gun. And it was over. He was 50 years old. He had $13,000 that he'd taken from a grocery store and that he never got to spend. He had no family we know of, no home, no community, no history. He had the code. And the code had run out of road. 16 years later, Michael Mann wrote a screenplay about him. And he spent the next 16 years getting it right. And in 1995, Robert De Niro sat in a diner across from Al Pacino, and they had 4 sentences that became 8 minutes of one of the greatest scenes in cinema history, and it wasn't fiction. Not really. It was the truth dressed up in the clothes fiction wears. And 2 years after that, in North Hollywood, 2 men who had watched that movie tried to live it. and found out what Macaulay found out. That you can plan for everything except the thing you don't know about. That you can be smart and disciplined and prepared and still not be enough. That the house always wins. The movie made him a legend. The truth makes him human. And here is what I want you to carry out of this with you. Not the IQ score, impressive as it is. Not the Alcatraz detail, extraordinary as it is. Not the coffee shop scene, remarkable as it is. Neil Macaulay was a person who took something genuine and extraordinary about himself, a truly exceptional mind, a truly remarkable capacity for discipline and planning and awareness, and he pointed it at the wrong target. He used it to take things rather than to build them. He used it to disappear rather than to arrive somewhere. He used it in service of a code that left him, at the end of it all, utterly and completely alone. And that is the real tragedy here. Not the prison time. Not the death. The waste. The extraordinary, irretrievable waste of a mind and a will and a capacity that could have done almost anything, and chose this. Your intelligence is not wasted in a parking lot on the southwest side of Chicago. Your discipline is not being spent in service of a code that ends in isolation. Your capacity to plan and to execute and to read a room and to know when something is wrong, all of that is yours. And what you do with it, what you point it at, what you build with it, that's the question that this story asks and that only you can answer. Don't let it be $13,000 and 6 bullets. Make it something that lasts. Neil Macaulay had a 136 IQ. He spent 25 years in prison, including 4 in solitary at Alcatraz. He came out and built a crew and pulled 6 heists in 2 years with the discipline of a military general. He sat in a coffee shop with the cop who was hunting him and said exactly what was going to happen. And he was right. And in the end, 1 cop, 1 grocery store, 1 moment of not having a reason to walk away. That's all it took. The movie made him a legend. The truth made him human. If this video gave you something, a fact you didn't know, a story you'll carry with you, a question that's going to sit in the back of your mind for a few days, share it with 1 person. That's literally all I ask. Text it to someone. Send it to the person who loves Heat. Send it to the person who has never seen Heat but loves true crime. Send it to the person who you think would stay up too late watching something like this because it's worth staying up for. Because this story deserves to be seen. And if you want more, if you want to do this every single week, real stories behind things you thought you knew, the actual history underneath the film or the legend or the myth, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell. Because I'm not stopping. We're just getting started. See you in the next one.